we're going to be covering some tips on making this lace circular yoke design by Irene Woods, which can be found on her Circular Machine Knit Yoke Facebook group. I'll be giving some tips on how to do the hand manipulated lace sections, as well as showing this lovely latch tool decorative trim for the neckline. To start the yoke, I'm going to be using a cast on rag and some ravel cord, which is a thin nylon cord. And I'll be bringing out the needles that I require for my size all the way out. I'll be taking a credit card tool to open the latches. Just run that all the way along. To make sure all of your latches are open and laying flat. And then take the cast on rag and we'll slowly place each hole on the rag onto a needle. So I'll leave a few centimetres at either end, and I'll just place these one hole in the rag for one needle to come through. And just carry that on all the way across until you're ready to add in the ravel cord. So you're ready to put in your ravel cord now. So we're going to unravel it off of this storage bobbin. A generous length, because you need enough to knit a very loose tension row across all of your selected needles. I normally keep this on my lap. I take a peg for the end and thread the carriage. My carriage is set to tension dial 10. And as I knit across, my hand is holding the ravel cord above the sinker plate and just gently guiding the cord into there. You don't want to put a lot of tension on this. And if you haven't unravelled enough cord, just unravel a little bit more and carry on. See why you need a generous length. Take the ravel cord out of the sinker plate, and you can see our loose row all the way along. So to start this pattern, you normally want to have your carriage on the right. There's a few different ways that you can get across there. With the Knit Master, we can push this button here, which lifts the carriage up, and that allows a free pass when needles are in B position. With the Brother, you can push in your part buttons, which will slip when the needles are in B position. Or you can pull everything out to D position on Knit Master, and it's E position on the Brothers. If you pull all of these needles out, this is also known as holding position. On Knit Masters, for holding position, we want to flip these front rustle levers from the 2 to 1 position, and for the brothers you have a lever on the left hand side of the carriage that will go from N to H, H for hold. Once it's set to these positions, you can just slide the carriage across. You're now ready to start with the main yarn, so reset your row counter and adjust your tension dial to what you have calculated for your swatch. We are now ready to knit with the main yarn. However, you'll remember you had your carriage set for holding position, so you want to reset those settings on whichever brand of machine you have. I have my tension turned down. In the pattern it suggests for the lace section to do a tighter tension for the lace, so you can select whether or not you'd like to do that. And we're going to knit our first row, and I always hang a peg on any of the tails, and that's how to thread the carriage. I'll show you a close-up once I've completed the first rows on how to select your spine stitches, and after you've knit the 2 rows for the first transfer in the chart, I'll then show how to read the knitting. To select your needles for the first transfer section, this is tier 1, we want to count the recommended number of needles, and I normally just pull it forward slightly to select it, and then I'll count the second recommended number, and I'll pull it forward, and I'll carry on with that second recommended number all the way along. And what I do is, to begin with, if you're not sure on reading your knitting, I just take a marker pen, make sure it's not permanent, and because my number strip is laminated, I can just mark on the number strip where these needles are, and for that first tier I'll be able to quickly reference what needle I need to make the transfers onto. So we have all of our spine stitches marked, and you can choose whether or not you want to also mark the number strip with a pen. And we're just going to start with the left hand. I do both my increases at the same time. So for tier 1, it asks you to transfer a number of stitches from the left and from the right of the spine stitch. So I'm using my 7-prong transfer tool, and I've set it to the required number of stitches. Make sure the latch is open. I'm going to take these needles and push that one back and complete the first transfer. Now you can decide whether you'd like to pull these all the way out or leave them in. Just remember, this centre spine stitch you will need to make a second transfer movement onto it. So that centre spine stitch has 3 stitches, and you should have an empty needle on either end, and you move on to the next one. So here's my spine stitch, push that back, Select the needles for transferring. Make the transfer. Come to the other side. Make that transfer. Move over to the next spine stitch, and I'll carry this on all the way along and knit the 2 rows, and I'll come back and show you how to read the knitting if you decide that you don't want to mark your bed. So we've come in closer now, and this is if you want to read the knitting rather than marking the bed or counting. So I've decreased my transfer tool down by 1 needle so that I'm moving less stitches per transfer. I can see where my last eyelet was, and I can follow that up to the needle, and I know that I want to come over by 1, so I select the next lot of needles, make the transfer, place the needles, and I do the same on this side. I can see where the eyelet from the last row was. I go over by 1, select those needles and transfer. And you can see where the next eyelet will form, and I just work that all the way across the bed for each row that requires the transfers, remembering to decrease your transfer tool every time. I just want to show again the way that you can read the knitting so you don't have to keep referring back and forth to the pattern. So I'm now up to the stage where I have to transfer 2 needles. I can see which needle formed the last eyelet, so I come over by 1. I take those needles, transfer them to the right, place them on. I now know this rightmost needle is a double stitch, that's my spine stitch, so I want to go over 1 to the next set of needles and transfer those 2 left, and then come across. Here's the last eyelet, go over 1 to the right, take those needles, transfer them right. The rightmost needle that we transferred is our spine stitch, go over 1 again, take those 2 needles and transfer them to the left, so that centre stitch has 3 stitches. Then we come up to our next eyelet, over 1 set of needles to the right, take those needles, transfer them right. That's our centre spine stitch, so we move over 1 again from the right, and take those to the left, and I work in this manner every time for all of the transfers within this pattern. I'll then move on to showing you what I do instead of waste yarn once we've completed the transfers. I've completed my final single stitch transfers, and what you have to remember in the pattern is you want those empty needles to be pushed back. And rather than taking this off onto waste yarn, I'll be utilising my garter bar, which is really an oversized transfer tool. To work the garter bar, before we transfer stitches, we need to knit this row, so ensure your empty needles are back to A position. Knit across, I used the back of the garter bar to pull these needles forward. I then use my hand to push the work behind the latches. You don't have to worry which way you have the garter bar, because we're not going to be turning it. We're just going to be taking these stitches off and then laying them back on the correct number. So I hang it on the machine, and to check that every needle is seated correctly, I just run my finger along, and each needle should be hitting off the garter bar. If you have a missed needle, when you run your hand across, it will feel quite loose. So I'm now ready to bring the work off the machine. I know from reading my pattern what needles need to be pushed out of work for the second tier. All of my stitches are now on the garter bar. What I'm going to do is I'm just going to push the garter bar still in the hook of the needles. I'm going to push it towards the machine slightly so that it opens the latches. I'm going to lift the work away from the machine, and I'm just holding it on my lap here, and I'm going to select which needles need to be out of work and pull forward the needles that were in a position from the single row transfer, and make sure all of your latches are open. I normally just use my thumb as they come past the gate pegs. So I have the correct number on this end, the correct number on this end. There's a latch that isn't open. So I'm now ready to put this back on to the machine. However, because we had needles out of work, there are some of these that don't have stitches on them. So I'm going to give you a close-up in a minute to show you the process for moving these stitches along. So I'm going to sit this on, making sure the end stitch is on the end needle, sit it on the machine, run my finger under just to make sure that every needle is caught in the garter bar, and I'll move you in a bit closer. So we're ready to start our transfers. You can see here I've just left the garter bar to hang. This is a very handy option if you get distracted or interrupted during your knitting session. I have the end prong with the end stitch on the end needle, and I'm going to take my index finger, and in this motion on the underside I'm going to push the stitches towards the needles, and you can give them a little bit more of a push. And I normally like to take my thumb or finger, and any that are towards the edge, I can use my finger to push them over. Now we have an empty prong here, so we want to be moving, so we lift it up off the needles and over to the right by one. Now we have that single stitch, and I normally just use my finger to push the single stitch, and again an empty prong, so we're going to lift, move it over by one. Now you can see here have a needle that hasn't seated properly, and this is the section of stitches that I want to be pushing on. So I'm going to lift it again and reseat it, and you can just sort of give it a wiggle by side to side. Okay, so next empty needle, all of these are seated correctly. Index finger on the underside and push the stitches towards the needles. You can see here this is split slightly, so just use my finger. And for the rest, before the empty prong, lift, move over. Doesn't matter that it's not seated correctly now, because all of these stitches are onto the needles. So I have my next needle, push that single stitch, lift, move over, and again make sure that all of the needles are seated into the prongs of the transfer tool or the garter bar. So this is up to this stitch are the ones I want to be pushing onto the needles. So I want to push that forward, come up above and use my hand, and I'm going to continue this method all the way along the bed. Just move the garter bar one space every time there's an empty prong. We're now finished moving all these stitches with the garter bar. They're all sitting in the hooks of the needles. You can either push the work back towards the gate pegs, so behind the latches, or what I prefer to do is I just take the end of the garter bar and I just push all the needles back to B position, and I knit my row. And that completes tier 1. If you've marked your bed with pen, just take a cotton bud and go along and rub off the marks. And then follow the pattern for tier 2, and again choose whether you'd like to mark the number strip with a pen or whether you prefer to just read the knitting to see where the last eyelet was created. So I'll come back in another video to show the technique that I use for the decorative hem. Don't forget to subscribe and hit the thumbs up button if you enjoyed this video. Feel free to leave a comment, and until the next time, you've been watching Buttonmouse the Wee Machine Knitter.